Welcome to The Imposters. This is a podcast about expertise. Who gets to define it? Who gets recognized as an expert? And whose knowledge is overlooked in humanitarian and development spaces? The Imposters recenters aid around affected communities and lived expertise. In each episode, I speak with refugees, migrants, and Global South practitioners whose expertise is shaped by experience, context, and leadership. These conversations explore what expertise and legitimacy look like in the sector, and how imposter syndrome is often a systemic outcome rather than a personal failure. Each guest joins the Imposters, an archive of lived experience experts in global development. We are a growing network of practitioners committed to elevating lived expertise in humanitarian and development work. I am your host, Laila Raouf. Welcome to the Imposters. Welcome, everyone, to The Imposters. Throughout this season, we've spoken to practitioners, researchers, and leaders navigating systems that often don't recognize the full depth of their expertise, especially when that expertise is shaped by lived experience. But as we come to the final episode, the question becomes, what would it take to actually build something different? Today, I'm joined by Fadela Novak-Irons, a leader with over 25 years of experience across government, the United Nations, and civil society, working at the intersection of humanitarian, development, and peace-building efforts. Fadela's work is grounded in a commitment to agency and solidarity, bringing together communities, institutions, and refugee-led organizations to reimagine how systems can operate. In this conversation, we explore the power of participation and what it really means to shift from inclusion to agency. I'm so excited to welcome Fadela to the Imposters. Hi, Fadela. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Lila. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited too to be part of this conversation. Thank you for creating this space, Lila.
I'm so excited to have you, especially for the final episode, because I've been following your work for some time now, and it's the perfect way to wrap up what we're trying to do here at the Imposters. And I'm sure our listeners know at this point that I like to start every episode with the same question. So, do you ever feel like an imposter in humanitarian spaces?
Yes, it's so funny. I'm laughing, Lila, because I was just signed there a couple of weeks ago. I was preparing to go to the Skull Week in Oxford with all of the events around the Skull World Forum. And I sent a message to a very dear friend of me saying, I cannot believe it. At the age of 58, here I am again, feeling that I'm a total fraud, walking into this space, the Skull Forum and all of the events with all of these experts around me. And, when do you ever get over this feeling that you're a fraud, that you're an imposter? It seems like there is no getting rid of it. Her answer was very interesting. It was talking about every time that you level up, it's there. And I'm certainly feeling that I am leveling up after all these years within the UN system. So, yes, it is definitely there, Lila.
Thank you for sharing that. Over the course of this season, we've been exploring who gets to be seen as an expert in global development. From your perspective, how have the systems you've worked in shaped the definition of expertise? And do you think that has anything to do with this imposter feeling we all have?
It's a very good place to start. I think there are many elements that come into play when this imposter feeling is felt, as was the case for me. There's, of course, a very strong gender component to it. I don't think that there is a need to develop further on that. There's a ton of literature about how women do tend to feel like imposters more so than men. There's also a cultural component, whether you are sharing in the culture that is dominant in the place where you're working. The experience where I was walking into Oxford, with the whole aura of a place like Oxford University, British, American dominated event, though totally international. That element of culture is also there. It's very coded the way you are to act when you are to be seen and labeled as an expert. And those codes are culturally defined and not available necessarily to all of us in the same way. But that is in the humanitarian system, and perhaps that is where I would prefer to focus now, Lila, if that's okay, is really how I have seen the expertise being defined in the humanitarian system where I've worked over 25 years. And it's very much an institutional framework that defines it. You look at job description, we're talking about having the right academic qualification, the number of years of experience in the sector, the institutional affiliation. Do you already have experience with a UN agency before applying to this, or do you have experience with international NGOs when you're invited to speak as a leader or as an expert in a forum organized by those international organizations? It's always those institutional frameworks that have the high hand on how the formal credentials are going to be put forward first. There's also the technical, and in the same vein, the technical experience. The humanitarian system, and you know that, is very dominated by sectoral specialization. You're a WASH expert or you're a protection expert. Within protection, are you a JBV expert or a child protection expert, etc., etc. And there are lots of methodologies that are very much shaping up our language as experts that we also need to be able to reference or be able to compare against our practice, our results, our methodologies. We're talking about the sphere standards, the ISC guidelines. So there is really a control here again by these UN agencies, these international NGOs on the technical narrative of who is an expert or not. And there is very clearly, of course, behind all of this, power dynamics, generally donor driven definitions. And I was thinking about the Gen Cap and, the gender experts that are deployed to support a response, a humanitarian response somewhere. You've got the monitoring and evaluation, the meal specialists, and refugees, the people that, the bulk of my expertise or experience over the past 25 years has been centering on. Refugees do not get that label. So it goes beyond me feeling like an imposter. Now we're at a system level where refugees would be seen as mere community liaison, not as the project managers, and would face language barriers or access to platform barriers through, travel, the ability to have a passport, to get a visa, to be invited in the first place to actually be there. And those are the platforms as well where we are declared, where we are labeled experts. It's by being at Oxford, by being seen and heard in those fora, that's the Skull Week organizers, whether it's the Skull Foundation or the Marmalade Festival, the Sidebar, all of those organizers actually provide spaces where we are all attempting to be seen and respected as experts. And the refugees are not there, are not able to access those spaces. So it's very much a space that's dominated by institutional framework, institutional priorities, power dynamics, as well as legacy of how this humanitarian system has come to be with the white savior approach that we have had, and now trying to correct that through localization.
Thank you for that answer. It definitely validates why I wanted you on this podcast for season one to kind of round it out because all these different conversations we've been having over the past 9 episodes, this is like a great summary, really direct summary of what we're getting at here with the imposters. This project, I like to use the term lived experience, that type of knowledge. Do you have an opinion on why this type of experience isn't considered knowledge or expertise and why it's still sidelined?
It is still very much sidelined, and there's still a lot of work to get there. The hashtag shift the power, the whole movement around that, the all of those efforts show how timely this conversation is, Lila, but also how much more work and how long the journey is still ahead of us, sadly so. Live this experience based on what I have seen and the experiences that I have had in quite a lot of places and with quite a lot of actors. And this is not just UNHCR, where I was employed for 18 years, but the UN agencies in general, the international NGOs as well as national NGOs do not recognize the lived experiences as a sign or as a contribution of expertise. It really is simply an add on or at best, a tokenism in participation. So refugees are invited to meetings, they're invited to contribute an experience, their lived experience. They're heard, they're listened to genuinely more and more, but it does not lead to policy or decisions on funding, for instance. We have the Refugee Advisory Board experiences that are widening, which is fantastic. This is a major shift in the sector. I've been working with, with governments for close to 20, 25 years now. Uh, when I was with the government of New Zealand, we were bringing their ministries to be accountable to those consultations and report back quarterly. From that experience, which was close to 25 years ago, um, we have now moved to more established refugee advisory board, which is a fantastic experience, where states that are also receiving asylum seekers establish a refugee advisory board that they consult, sometimes even through formal consultation processes that are very well developed and documented as to how governments are expected to do so before developing a policy, etc., which is fantastic. But there is a but there again. There is no voting power for those refugees on those refugee advisory boards. As their names indicate very clearly, they're just there to provide advice. Very important again, but the lived experience is not seen as the full scale expertise that will be making the final policy or funding decisions. And very often, those lived experiences are merely mined for data through those focus groups, those needs assessment, and not necessarily credited.
Right. So let's talk about meaningful participation. I know you speak a lot about agency and solidarity through your work. How is that different from the way the sector typically talks about participation or inclusion?
Yeah. When we started the discussions around Calls Network, the civic organization that we have recently set up to promote refugee agency and humanitarian action, we have asked ourselves a lot of questions around what should the values be that are underpinning the work, the conceptualization of the work that we saw ourselves doing with refugee-led organizations and refugee leaders in the future. And the word participation, including meaningful participation, was on the table. And we made the very clear decision not to go for meaningful participation. We decided not to go for meaningful participation because we felt that we wanted to go beyond meaningful participation, which is fantastic if you already have that. It's a starting point, but to our minds, it wasn't enough. And we needed to go towards agency and solidarity, as you have rightly said, um, Lila. For us, meaningful participation is problematic from the start because where would these refugees, refugee leaders, refugee-led organization be invited to participate? This sentence is on its own problematic. They are invited
Right.
to. They're not actual participants as the other experts are. So they're invited to participate, where that refugee is invited to provide his or her lived experience, share it, and that's ended with a thank you very much for this very moving testimony. And let's now turn to the issue.
Yeah.
Now the experts have the space. So that participation is very much tokenistic when it is limited to that. And that is so often the case. That quotation was something that I heard not more than just a few months ago by a, expert, extremely senior in a, also very well reputed UN agency. But that wasn't just him doing it to a refugee woman who was the first speaker. That is the way meaningful participation is still all too often understood. For us at Calls Network, meaningful participation translates into a participation in agenda setting, in setting the format of the table at which the refugees or the refugee-led organization should be invited, and where that contribution is actually not just heard, listened to, acknowledged, but taken into account in the discussion and accounted back to at the end. And so we're not seeing that today in the refugee coordination model, for instance, that has absolutely the coordination model, the refugee coordination model sees participation at the national, subnational, local level, but there is no place for the refugees, the refugee-led organization to participate in that. So there is still a lot of space. And here my focus is on refugees, but the same would be equally true for the humanitarian country teams. They meet without any representation of internally displaced people or affected populations at the table when they make those decisions. So participation is still very tokenistic. It is a starting point. It needs to be there, and we need to go beyond it. And that's where agency and solidarity come in, because they require shift, a real shift, a shift in the power, a shift in the power dynamic, a shift in who actually is setting the agenda and where that meeting will take place, at what time, how will the refugees be taken to, transported to that space, how do we make sure that the limitation on their freedom of movement, but also the monies that they have or do not have, their budgets, allow them to take part. So all of those questions are important. And for us in Calls Network, we would want to go beyond that, of looking at a shift in terms of recognizing the refugees not as mere beneficiaries and therefore our accountability to them as beneficiaries, but as agents in the response itself, as people and organizations and actors ultimately who should be there from the start of the response to co-design with the other actors the programs, the way the response should be shaped and the way it should be implemented. And the solidarity is the ultimate space where we actually recognize with a lot of humility the limitation of our own expertise, the limitation of what we bring as international actors or even as national NGOs, but not with the lived experience that the refugees uniquely have, the connections that they are uniquely positioned to have within the communities that are affected, and that we're all there to serve ultimately. So a lot of humility, and also the steps that we take to enter equitable partnership and to share that accountability, to lobby for refugee-led organizations to be funded directly, not necessarily through my international or national NGO or my UN agency, but actually directly. That's what solidarity would actually entail. And that's why at Cause Network, we decided not to simply go for inclusion and meaningful participation, but actually push our values to be those of agency as well as solidarity.
Yeah, that's a great explanation of the difference. And it's true that as I'm reflecting, meaningful participation and inclusion are such passive words because it still does not place the affected population in the decision making position or driver's seat, whereas agency and solidarity are addressing the underlying power dynamics that I think a lot of the work misses, which is why I like your organization because it's inherently decolonial. And I'm of the positionality that if you don't address the power dynamics, then there will be no change. Do you think the sector is truly ready to shift power towards communities? Or do you think we're just still operating within the same systems but using different language like localization?
No, sadly, Leela, I would love to be able to say that yes, the system has learned its lesson. At the moment, with the crisis in funding, but behind it, there are also lessons that need to be drawn about the crisis in the legitimacy of the system itself, in how its architecture has been set up, who by, for whose interest, and the system, unfortunately, sadly so, has not yet actually engaged in those discussions. So we've had the UN reset. If you're in the UN, you have the humanitarian reset. If you're, international NGO and UN agencies, but the fundamentals of the way the system operates are not actually questioned. They're not even on the table as a point of discussion, sadly. And so localization, as it has been conceptualized and implemented over the past 10 years since the commitments to localization in 2016, have been merely performative. And there is just more of that performative approach at the moment, when actually we have a unique moment for us to actually go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, is the humanitarian system as we designed it all these years back, as we have reformed it over the past decades, is it still fit for purpose? And um, it is not. Its crisis shows that, and it's not a mere financing crisis. The government's cutting back or slashing the humanitarian and the international aid budgets, generally speaking, but the system is ineffective because it doesn't center the communities. We've had a lot of, again, back to the standards that I was referring to at the beginning of our discussion, Lila, when I was talking about expertise. Another of those standards is to um, to put people at the center, to have accountability to affected population, acronym AAP. And there's a whole industry, literally a whole industry around those. Unfortunately, without actually centering the communities, we will only be tinkering around the edges on effective accountability, effective humanitarian responses. Unless the people themselves are actually centered and they are the source of the co-design of the programs and the responses, we will still be coming at it with a top down. We know the answers. We're the experts. We've got that technical expertise, don't we?
So, you founded the Calls Network, which, as I understand, connects grassroots communities in Europe with refugee-led organizations in the global South. Can you elaborate or, take us back a couple of steps about what gap you were trying to address when you first created it?
Yeah. Um, it was years and years, Lila, in the system of trying to find ways, genuinely trying to find ways of making the system work better and not being able to do so. And not because I hadn't tried hard enough, not because I had tried on my own in partnership with others, but simply because the system is unable to work in a different way by placing the communities at the center. My area of focus all these years has been, in addition to being in management, has been protection, and that's where we place at UNHCR community-based protection. And I find that when I saw all of the literature, the guidance, the practices in UNHCR coming out around community-based protection, I honestly had hope that we could actually finally be able to go towards a practice that would be fundamentally different, that would center the people that we served, the refugees, that would recognize that agency and place that agency at the center. Unfortunately, as is often the case with institutional frameworks, the whole thing was taken up by procedures, processes, and ultimately ended up being more performative. um, and I am talking about one of the best that came out of the system with a real intention behind it. So that's where the spark came from, that realization that we would not be able to do it and that we needed to build differently and unfortunately outside the system. So that's why I left UNHCR to create Calls Network and came across others, the co-founders who also um, had seen the limitations of trying to find a space for refugee-led organization in our humanitarian and refugee coordination model, a place for them to participate, to be full actors and not mere recipients of small partnership agreements, small funding on the side, but actually really be full actors. So that's what brought us to create Calls Network. The gap is very much where refugees are seen still today as mere recipients and not agents. We have all cut our capacities, our presence, our responses in the field. And so often, who's left behind? The refugees. Who's left standing and still delivering? The refugees. They're doing it with their communities, volunteering, finding ways of making it work, making it happen, finding ways to fund with whatever they're able to raise in terms of mobilize in terms of funding. They are there. They are still there and they will continue being there. So that had to be the starting point for us. And we believe that with a different kind of solidarity than the one that has been promoted by the entire ecosystem of looking at the people in the global north as mere individual donors, but actually seeing that there are many other ways that grassroots communities and the public may wish to express their solidarity and be in solidarity, standing with refugees beyond their individual donation, and doing that by supporting through the expertise they have, the experience, the time, their ability to raise funding around them in their community or through their network, leveraging the power of their own networks, each of them people have so many ways in the global north to be able to show the solidarity with the refugees and the refugee-led organization in the global and in the global south, that we felt a need to build those bridges. Otherwise, those efforts will not be able to find a channel to express themselves.
So, if you were to imagine a future where refugee agency and solidarity are truly at the center, what do you think global development would look like? Or would development not exist anymore? What do you think?
No, I think it would exist. It would still exist because the expertise that each actor in the ecosystem brings has value and it has its place. So it's not about it's those actors merely by grassroots actors. I think that would be a misconception of what can be achieved. The refugee-led organization have unique advantages over a UN agency or over an international NGO or even over a local an NGO. They've got links in their communities. They've got expertise that comes out of their lived experience of exile, of being forced out of your country, of being having to restart your life, of the cultures that we have and their diversities within those communities that no one else will ever be able to equate. But the technical expertise that UN agencies, as intergovernmental bodies with their access to governments in ways that refugees and refugee-led organizations will never be able to have, they will also continue to have a space and a role to play in the future system, whatever shape it will take. And likewise for international NGOs, they represent a different type of solidarity, one that comes from grassroots for some of them, that comes from constituencies that are different from the interests of states, and therefore the interests that intergovernmental organizations such as the UN may be able to represent. For me, the future of the humanitarian ecosystem is one where these actors have a much more balanced, a much more equitable, much more shared access to resources, to platforms, to visibility, and where the expertise, allow me that term, the expertise of each one of them is recognized with or everything it brings to the final response. Every one of them has a role to play.
Love how you just so you really directly and openly talk about the system, which I really appreciate because it makes it easier than me having to try to like tiptoe around this word. So I like to use this word too. So who do you think the system still treats as an imposter? Because throughout this season, we've pretty much come to the conclusion that it's not an individual failure. It's more of a symptom. It's more systemic than that. So who do you think the system still treats as the imposter?
I think it's all those that are outside of those institutions that the existing power dynamics allow to set the rules of the game. Anyone outside of it would be seen as an imposter. That woman who gave her testimony, yes, the story, the narrative was seen and heard to be moving, but the expertise behind everything that she was talking about, she was an imposter as far as those experts were considered when it came to talking about the real technical issue.
Mm. For those of us who, agree and we want to support and we want to get involved with similar initiatives, what's your advice? How can we get involved to support this type of systems change?
There are so many levels depending on where you are sitting in the ecosystem. For international NGOs, there's a real responsibility, and it's a historic responsibility to actually walk the talk of solidarity all the way to the end. with refugee-led organization and with, if you're not working with refugees, but in internally displaced context, with the people that are affected by crises, by wars, to walk that talk all the way to the end, meaning truly lobbying the donors for a change in policies, for refugee-led organizations and community-based organizations to be able to receive funding directly, and the type of funding that they absolutely need, which is core funding and flexible funding, to actually lobby the humanitarian country teams or in whatever refugee coordination model is operating in the response that you're in, to ensure that there is not just a seat at the table for refugee representative leaders, but that the table is co-designed with them. There is a real responsibility for international NGOs to do so. If you are a individual in the global north, showing your solidarity and living that solidarity in very concrete ways with refugee-led organization, by giving more visibility to what they're doing, by raising awareness about the complexities of the responses and why the current humanitarian system, which is very much charity-based, doesn't actually help the people the way it should help them, and that we need that shift from charity to solidarity to agency. There are so many ways that individual people can do so, by volunteering, by using their networks, by supporting the refugee-led organization. If you're a national-led organization locally, not seeing the refugee-led organization competitors, but as allies in the response, working together to be able to actually support change to happen.
I like that you call out the competition, which is such a depressing aspect of all of this. But the idea that refugee-led organizations could be competing with national organizations, that's a really sad reality that we kind of have to deal with and face.
Indeed.
If anyone was interested in supporting or they wanted to connect, how could they reach out with calls or connect with you?
So just reach out to us on our email address. You can find it on our website, callsnetwork.org, and we'll be very, very happy to hear from you and where you're coming from and how you could potentially help us. Yes, there is so much still to be done, Lila, as we're just setting up this organization.
Well, congratulations on your success so far. It's such a great initiative, and even in, like, the short time I've known you, you've really expanded and grown, so you're a real inspiration for me with this Imposters project, and I hope we can, like, continue to support each other through partnership or collaboration in the future. But thank you again, Fidela. This was such a nice conversation. I'm still processing everything we've talked about, but it was such a nice way to end this season. And your organization is something that I hope people can feel hopeful about. Because this is such a depressing time for humanitarian work. But your organization is really out there serving a great model for the future of humanitarian work. So I just wanted to thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Lila, for these really kind words. I'm really, really touched. Thanks for having me here. But also thank you for relating it not just to me, but to the work that we're trying to do collectively at Calls Network. And I love how you ended up on the note of hope. So yes, it is what we're hoping to be able to build. Thank you.
So, as we close out today, something that's come up again and again this season is that the issue isn't whether expertise exists, it's whether we choose to recognize it. And this conversation really pushes that further because it's not just about recognizing lived experience, it's about what we do with it. Do systems actually change, or do we just get better at talking about it? I think what Fidela shared reminds us that there are people already trying to build something different. The question is whether the rest of the system is willing to meet them there. Thank you so much for listening to The Imposters. And that's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's conversation, visit theimposters.org, where you can explore episode resources and browse the wider archive of lived experience experts. Tune in to The Imposters wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lila Raouf. Thanks so much for listening.